My name is Donald Ross, and I am about to begin my 80th year on this planet. Whereas I was born in Kenosha, Wisconsin, we left there I left there with my parents at an early age, and we moved to the southern tip of Texas, a farm not too far from Edinburgh, Texas, where I grew up. An interesting little sidelight is that while I was in high school, I had no idea what my future in life would be, but my sister took a course in chemistry and flunked it. Sibling rivalry being what it was, I took the course and not only passed it, but made an A in it. And it was taught by a professor from the adjoining junior college. And he became a very good friend for the rest of my life, or the rest of his life, since he's dead now. But he urged me when I graduated from high school at the tender age of 15, he asked me if I would be interested in an NYA job, National Youth Administration job. This was one of the many things that Roosevelt had put into effect. And I said, hey, if it would mean being able to go to junior college, I would love to. So I applied for it and received it. This job was for 36 hours a month at 25 cents an hour. And it was just helping Dr. Elliott in the laboratory. And it just so happens that in this year, 1939, the head of the NYA in Texas was Lyndon Baines Johnson. So I thank him and I thank Roosevelt. That $9 a month paid for my tuition. And it's incredible when I think back on it now that the $9 a month was the difference between my going to college or my being just a farm worker. So after this was 1939, and after junior college graduation in 1941, I got an NYA job at the University of Texas. There, I was paid 50 cents an hour, but expenses were a lot higher there. But I moved into a cooperative house. A cooperative house then was a house mother would rent a house, and she would feed and house whatever number of people there were in the house. And then at the end of the month, she'd divide up the expenses. And my first month's room and board at the University of Texas was $16.75. However, by the time I graduated in 1943, it had ballooned up to $24.50. So, but I majored in chemistry. In 1943, in the spring of 1943, I would be graduating. I had a deferment till I finished school, but I noticed on the bulletin board there in the chemistry department that a guy from Eastman Kodak Company was going to be interviewing students to hire. Since I had spent the past year as president of the Austin, Texas Camera Club, I was very much interested in photography. I said, this is a person that you got to talk to. And I tried to put my best foot forward. And some few days later, I learned that they were offering me a job. And I was absolutely delighted because as an organic chemist and knowing that Eastman Kodak has this great, fine chemical business, I thought this would be just hunky-dory. When I got the information as to where I was to report for work, I was surprised to find that I wasn't going to be working for Eastman Kodak in Rochester, New York. I was going to be working for Tennessee Eastman Corporation in some place called Clinton Engineering Works. And that is where I reported for work on the 21st of June, 1943. Let me set the scene. I'm a little country boy from a farm, you know, and I am now thrust into a place that I've never seen before among a lot of other people, many other people, in a big construction area. They were building. People over here are building houses. People over here are building various construction projects for uranium separation, which I never heard of. But at any rate, there's an awful lot of business. And our first few days there were to sit in classrooms while they told us a little something about what it is that we were going to be doing. Now, don't get the idea that they told us all about everything the Manhattan Project was doing. They did not. They didn't tell us anything except the specific process that we were going to be involved in. And I say we because a group of people came in on the same day. There were two fellows from the University of Idaho, and there was an engineer from Tupelo, Mississippi. There was an engineer from Georgia Tech. There was an electronics guy from University of Tennessee. There was 6 or 8 or 10 people, and we kind of formed a little pod. I mean, we were all, this was new to all of us, and so we kind of we lived in a dormitory right next to each other and so forth. So we didn't know what we were going to do, but they were telling us about this specific process that we were going to be involved in, the separation. Now, I've got to be careful here because during the entire war, I never heard the word uranium a single time, either in the plant or any place. Nobody referred to uranium. If you wanted to refer to uranium-235, this was called R. If you wanted to refer to 238, this was called Q. And everything associated with this process had a code name to it, a code letter to it. Not necessarily a name, but a letter to it. When you think about it now, years later, the conversation is a little on the ridiculous side as you kept spilling in these J's and the Q's and the R's and the D's and the E's and so forth. Well, maybe later on I'll identify which was which, and so that you can get a better feel for what this process was. I don't know. We were, we had come from all over the country. We knew that we were certainly told this was a secret operation that we were dealing with. But that, the first night, maybe it was the second night after we got there, this little pod of 8 or 10 people sitting around in a dormitory room, using the background and an experience of the physicist, the engineer, the chemist, and so forth. And a textbook that had just recently been put out, written by Pollard and Davidson. I don't even know how it's possible for me to remember the authors of this book, but Pollard and Davidson was kind of our Bible. By the end of that evening, we had figured out what it was that we were doing and why we were doing it. It was, as I say, I don't know whether we may very well have been disobeying the security regulations there. But hey, look, we're just reading Pollard and Davidson. I mean, that's a book you can buy in the library. So that's how we got started. And the first 3 weeks that I was there, till sometime in about the second week in July, was spent just in classroom activities in which they would fill us in on what it is that was going on in. That's another thing. Everything seems to have code names to it, because they didn't refer to the plant that we were going to be working in. They didn't refer to that as the electromagnetic separation plant. No, they referred to it as Y12. Across the hill was another place called X10, and over a few miles in another direction was K25, and along the river was S50. Everything had to be coded in, and so it was. But the building that was going to house this process was not finished. And I guess they figured, hey, we don't want to keep these people here doing nothing for months. And so they packed us up, 8 or 10 of us, and sent us to the radiation lab at the University of California. This was my first train ride. And I was just wide-eyed in crossing the Rocky Mountains and everything. And we were set up in some sort of rooming houses in Berkeley, California. And there we got to see for the first time what it was that we were going to be operating. Years later, I mean really years later, they started calling it the Calutron. But in 1943, they didn't call it the Calutron. It was a D. Well, one of the reasons they called it a D, the piece of equipment a D, is that it was shaped like a D. And that was a natural letter for it to be. There we worked until probably the end of October. We worked shift work because we were going to be working shift work when we got back to Oak Ridge. The University of California had set up 2 units, 2 Ds, that is a magnet and 2 Ds for training purposes. And there, amid all these future Nobel Prize winners, this little group of people are learning the process of separating uranium isotopes by the electromagnetic separation process. Now, I don't know how much you might like to know about how this process works, but basically, really ultra simply, they have a charge bottle in which, well, first of all, the unit in use is in a vacuum. Keep in mind that it's in a vacuum. And it's also in a magnetic field. Those two are kind of givens. But, but in this D, there's a charge bottle of something called uranium oxychloride. This, when heated up, will form a vapor. Now, so they have this charge bottle with coils around it to heat it up. Now, the vapor from this uranium charge bottle goes up into a little chamber made out of carbon, in which at one end of the chamber is a tantalum filament called a K. It is heated up separately and gets to a very high temperature and gives off electrons. The electrons coming across this little chamber with this uranium vapor, oxychloride vapor in it, forms an arc. This arc is called a J. Now, because these electrons ionize these particles, they become charged. And the charge, keep in mind this is in a magnetic field, and there are two sets of electrodes above it, and these electrodes are charged with thousands of volts of electricity, and the first one is called a C. That electrode is called a C, and there's another one above it whose letter I can't remember. But keep in mind these are now charged particles, and so they are accelerated through these slits. But as they are accelerated, the magnetic field causes them to turn. Now, I would say that this D is probably maybe 12 to 15 feet wide. And so they adjust the accelerating voltage such that these these charged particles, which contain uranium now, will come over and hit a receiver called an E. Now, because these two uranium isotopes that are part of this mess, because they have different weights, they are going to, and they're ionized, but they are different weights. They're going to have a slightly different radius of their turn in the magnetic field. Not very much, but this E over here has two little pockets in it that these two kinds of electrons will they're driven into it, and where they pick up the electron and become just plain old uranium-238 or uranium-235. And the result of this whole process, the reason that this whole plant was built, is so that over here in this E, they get as much and as pure a uranium-235 as they possibly can. And they get this one charged particle at a time from this effect of the magnet on these charged uranium particles. Now, later on, they will take out this E after the unit has used up all the uranium in it. They will take out this E and they will take it to another building where they harvest this little bit of U-235, which, what do you remember what it's called? U-235 is R, and the U-238 is Q. And so they gather up all the Q. It is of no real use to anybody, but that R is the mother lode. That is what all of this is about. So that's what we trained on for several months in Berkeley. And hey, we didn't do much traveling while we were out there because we worked 6 days a week, but we did get up to see the redwoods north of San Francisco, and we did get over to San Francisco every once in a while. I know this little pod of 8 or 10 of us went over to the top of the mark. Unfortunately, I was only 19. I couldn't have a drink, but we enjoyed our stay there. And then towards the end of October, we came back because in November, somewhere around the middle of November, they were going to start the first building of housing the equipment to separate this uranium. Maybe I better tell you what a building was. A building contained 2 racetracks. A racetrack was a circular magnet which had holes in it. It had places for these D's to fit in, and I think that there were 96. There are 96 Ds, no, maybe 48 Ds to a racetrack and 2 racetracks. And needless to say, nowhere in the world had there ever built anything like this, of this size and complexity. But we're going to start it up in the middle of November. And unfortunately, all sorts of problems held up the beginning of production. It had to do with the magnet. It had to do with the silver coils that were used in the magnet. It had to do with moisture that was in the oil that cooled the magnet coils. And I tell you, the General Groves and Ernest Lawrence and the people who built the plant, they were in a real tizzy. Of course, hey, I wasn't in a tizzy because I didn't even know what the problem was, but we had a period of a matter of months. It was into the next year before we were able to start it up and operate this particular building. This was 9201-1. The -1 is a kind of a prelude to the fact that there are going to be 5 of these buildings, of these 9201-1 buildings. And eventually they corrected the problems. I didn't know whether I was going to stay in 9201-1 for the rest of my life or what. But as soon as -2 was ready to start up, I was transferred over to -2, where we went through the same process again of starting up the various units and getting them into production. Incidentally, my title during this time was technical supervisor, now, that sounds great. I mean, I like the sound of it. We had there's one little East Tennessee girl. Well, some of them weren't so little. One East Tennessee girl for each of these units on each shift. Her job is to adjust the various knobs on the control panel to to raise and lower the various accelerating voltage, and to do whatever is necessary to keep the amount of Q to the very highest you can get it, and the highest ratio of Q to R that you could get. The high ratio of Q to R indicated that you had good separation. If you had a very low ratio, that meant that it was all over the place. It was some of your R may be going into the Q slot and vice versa. So the ratio of Q to R was what they were looking for. Now these persons, they had virtually no background for this kind of work at all, and they were given a certain amount of training, not to explain what was going on, but rather what to do to keep that ratio maximized. Well, my technical, I didn't supervise these people in the usual term. They had foremen there that took care of all of the things that supervisors do with people. My job was to assist them and to troubleshoot and to in some way to help them keep this ratio high. So I was called a technical supervisor, and I worked in 9201-2 until it was started up and in production, and then they transferred me to -3. Now in -3, and to make a long story longer, this is where I ended up with the permanent assignment. When we got that into operation, I just stayed there as a technical supervisor in -3. Now, there's one thing that was very important to me and a lot of other people during this period of time. We were at war. I came from Texas. In Texas, the draft boards are absolutely convinced that every live male should be in some branch of the armed forces. And so I had no sooner arrived at Clinton Engineering Works than I received my notice from the draft board to report for physical and induction into the Army. Well, I didn't know what to do, but here are these security people. They knew what to do. Security said, just give us this, your notice, and we'll take care of it. And so they appealed my notice to report or to come in for a physical. And I didn't think anything more about it. When we moved out to Berkeley, lo and behold, I get another notice that the draft board had turned down the appeal 11-0. As I say, they felt that men should be in the Army. And so, but I knew what to do this time. I took it to the security man. So we'll take care of it. I didn't get another bit of information on this until we got back to Oak Ridge, when I received another thing from my draft board. And on it, it said, deferred by order of the president. I was flabbergasted. Naturally, it made me feel, boy, you are pretty darn important because you are being deferred by the president. So I figured, hey, I won't have to go to the Army. Not so. In June of 1945, now I'd been working there now 2 years. In June of 1945, I received another notice telling me to report, not for a physical, but to report for induction at Fort McPherson in Atlanta. Now, naturally, I took this to the security people, and they said, gee, there's nothing we can do about it. They apparently feel that anybody who isn't over 21, can't be all that essential. And so you're going to be inducted into the Army. However, because you now have classified information in your, they didn't say hard disk, in your brain, you will not be sent overseas. We were not going to let you out. As a matter of fact, he said, we are going to, here I learned that there were several other people in K-25 and X-10 and Y-12 who were also being inducted at the same time. Another little pod, as it were, a different pod though. And they said, we are going to bring you back as part of our special engineer detachment. Well, those nice East Tennessee girls that I had been helping with there in 9201-3, they chipped in and bought me a farewell gift. It was a pen and pencil set, an Eversharp pen and pencil set. You don't remember Eversharp pen and pencil sets, but they advertised the Eversharp is guaranteed, not for years, not for life, but forever. That was a really great thing that they did. So with this little pod of people, we went to Fort McPherson. For 3 or 4 days, we were taking tests. They give you kind of an IQ test. They don't call it that, but that's what it's, and kind of an IQ test. And we'd had our physicals and whatnot. And then they sent the whole group of us, I guess there might be maybe 10 or 12 of us, to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. And we spent 3 weeks, or 2.5 weeks, in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. We knew we were coming back, but that corporal who was in charge of the platoon that we were in, he didn't know it, and he was determined to make life as miserable as possible for us. But it was a different thing. Because we knew we didn't have to go through 13 weeks of basic training. We only had 2.5 weeks of it, and we were sent back. This particular corporal was bragging to us about how on his test he got 100, and our group of people, I think the lowest score we had was 148 or something like that. And this only infuriated him that there was somebody that he was determined that he was probably going to be sent to officers candidate school because he had scored 100. Well, anyway, we were sent back, got back in the middle of July of 1945. You know that just 3 days ago, we celebrated the anniversary of the dropping of the first atomic bomb on the 6th of August. Here we had been in the Army about 6 weeks. About 6 weeks when the war ended. How are we going to get out of the Army? There were at this time 11 million people under arms. 11 million people in the armed forces, and they've got to get these people out in the fairest and most just way possible. And the way they set about doing it is that each person in the armed forces would get 1 point for every month that they were in the Army. And if they went overseas, they would get another 2 points if they spent X number of months in the overseas Army. And then they would start getting the people out, the ones that had the highest score first, and figuring this was the fairest thing to do. And I think it was. The only thing is, we only had 1 point. We had been in the Army 1 month. We only had 1 point. So I set out to try, and incidentally, after the war, they had this hugely expensive electromagnetic separation of uranium plant with its 25,000 employees. They had K-25's big old plant, and they had S-50's plant. And I didn't know, but they also had the Richland plant for making plutonium. But they had all this expensive plant. They decided that the S-50 plant is going to go. They shut it down immediately. Then they had to decide whether they wanted to have the K-25 plant or the Y-12 plant. And it didn't take them too long to decide that the K-25 plant would be a heck of a lot cheaper to operate than the Y-12 plant would be. And so they made the decision, I guess it was in the fall of 45, they made the decision to close down the Y-12 plant, or to discontinue the Y-12, not close down the plant, but to discontinue the electromagnetic separation. Well, what's going to happen? Here we are in the Army in a plant where the work we were doing is being stopped, and there were a number of alternative ways to get out of the Army. You could get out of the Army rapidly if you agreed to go back to graduate school in one of the sciences. And so I thought, boy, now I've been working in physics, knee deep in physics for the last 2 or 3 years. I think that I'd like to go back and get an advanced degree in physics. And so I wrote to the University of Texas, and I indicated what my would-be plans were. And they said, hey, we'd be glad to have you. Keep in mind, they said, inasmuch as you've only had one undergraduate course in physics, if you're going to take a graduate degree in physics, you're going to have to go back and take this, and this undergraduate before you start taking graduate courses. Well, obviously that was not going to be possible. So I eliminated that. But in January, 2 things happened. The federal government decided that they would like to test these weapons since they only had one test at Alamogordo, they'd like to test them under other circumstances. And so they had made arrangements to test nuclear weapons at Bikini, a place I'd never heard of, but I was to hear about it since. And so they said that those of you in the Special Engineer Detachment, if you would agree to go and work on this summer on the weapons testing group that's going to be in Bikini, when the tests are over, we'll let you out of the Army. Well, I was about ready to take them up on that, but as I said, there were two things that happened in January. The second thing was that I met a young lady that was to become my wife at some time in the future. And as time went on, after January and February, this I hate to use the term relationship. That's ridiculous because it sounds like it's something that it isn't. But we we were constant companions, and I decided that I didn't want to go to Bikini and the testing. I'd rather stay, because in February, a third opportunity arose. And that is, if you agreed to come back and work for your contractor, Tennessee Eastman, they would let me out of the Army. And so I filled out the proper paperwork, and I was separated from the Army in a very, very appropriate day, March the 2nd, Texas Independence Day. And one day before I was separated from the Army, they gave me my single stripe, and I had to have that sewed on so that I could be separated in my technical corporal. I was called a technical corporal, and I did. And incidentally, I haven't mentioned that also on the jacket that we wore in the Army, earlier we had been awarded the Special Engineer Detachment, which was part of the Corps of Engineers. But it was just the part that dealt with the the atomic energy work of that time. We got a special award, which we had also to put on our sleeve, and it was kind of like the old Roman. It was kind of a U-shaped flower arrangement thing, but it was a special award just for us. Needless to say, it didn't take long it was yellow. It didn't take long for the people in the special detachment to give it the nickname of the golden toilet seat. But it was our award, and nobody else got this except the Special Engineer Detachment. So after March the 2nd, I came back to work.
Well, I don't know, were you concerned that you were going to get the product sufficient to contribute to the war effort? Maybe that wasn't something you were aware, that everybody was nervous that this wasn't going to, you weren't getting enough uranium.
No.
Okay.
Golly whiz, I didn't know we weren't getting enough uranium. See, I only knew about this one separation process. I didn't know how much they were getting. And keep in mind that the people who did this separation, they worked in another part. They worked up on the hill. I think they called it the hill, building 9212. And that had an entirely different kind of security. I mean, you couldn't, a person with my kind of badge, with the particular buildings that I was allowed to go in, you couldn't get in up there I didn't know what they did up there. I mean, I knew that they separated the stuff out, but I didn't know how they did it. And it wasn't until much later when I started working on the health and safety of those people who worked up there. Then I was able to get up there and know how they do it and what they did it and so forth. But during the war, things were compartmentalized. You had a need to know or you didn't. And if you didn't, goodbye.
Now, what about social life? Did you have meetings with people?
You know, I talked about this this group that came in on the same day. It's about maybe 10 of us, I guess, from all over the country. We went out together to Berkeley, and we came back together. We formed what we referred to as the Bachelor's Club. And this group of 10 people provided their own entertainment. And we would go on a weekend to Gatlinburg, for example, or we would. An interesting thing that each of us of this group, when we came back from Berkeley, they were running out of dormitories. You know, they eventually had 98 dormitories, and these were each held several hundred people. You know, they had 98 of them, but they were running out of dormitories space, and they were building houses like mad, and so they put five of us in a house, just like a person in a family. They put us in a house. So there were about 3 houses for these 10 people, and so we had the best of all situations because we could provide entertainment in these houses. I mean, now, don't let your imagination go wild, but I meant we can have parties and have dinners and so forth. So we were not as dependent upon outside entertainment, but there was outside entertainment. For example, somebody set up a music listening group. So one evening a week, in the Townsite Recreation Center, they had a turntable, and somebody would be in charge of providing the music, and they would talk a little bit about the music and then show the music. So that groups of people would get together for that. Of course, there were sports. I was, from the very earliest time, I was a member of a bowling team there in Oak Ridge. There was an Oak Ridge Symphony Orchestra. It was directed by one of the scientists out at X10, and so we had music. Eventually, they had a high school, so that there were high school sports that you could go to or whatnot. I would say the low point in growing up there, single, didn't affect us so much, but you had to eat in cafeterias, and I would say that the cafeterias were of marginal goodness. I think that, you know, if you may have had if we had a Parisian cafeteria, you would eventually kind of get tired of it's kind of like institutional food. But we lived in houses, so we could cook our own food. And as a matter of fact, that played some role in my getting my wife to accept marriage. I guess she figured I'd do the cooking. Now, just a word or two about Oak Ridge. This was this was wild country with a few houses here and there and a few barns, but pretty wild country before it was selected as the place for getting this uranium separated, isotope separated. And then they came in and designed a city to meet the needs. And I think that they designed it magnificently. The city had certain main roads. Of course, the turnpike is the name of the big road that goes from one end to the other. But that's really not this doesn't get involved too much in the residential area. They had main roads were named after states. Needless to say, the one that the most main road was named Tennessee, but another main road was Pennsylvania Avenue, and these roads, except for Tennessee, these roads were named, and the names given them alphabetically from the east to the west. So if somebody lived on Alabama Avenue, you knew that he was over here in east, or in Arkansas, and then there's California and Delaware, and I know we lived at one time right close to Georgia, and right on the other side of town site is Michigan, and then Pennsylvania, and on out. Now, all of the streets, the residential streets that came off of these main roads, their names started with the same letter as the state. That is, if any road that, for example, I lived on Tucker, anybody would know that is off of Tennessee, because it is the same. We lived at our first house after we were married was on Madison. Everybody knows that Madison is off of Michigan. Now, but that's not all to make it convenient. The city was built on this big old hill, and as you went up the hill, alphabetically on the second letter up at the top of the hill is the high letters, like can't think of one right now, but some M-U or something would be up there, whereas Madison was down at the bottom of the hill. M-A was down at the bottom. So if you had somebody's address, you could pretty well know where they were because of the way it was drawn up. The name was given, I think, must have been in 43, towards the end of the summer or early fall, and was named after Black Oak Ridge. I mean, that was the name of the high point of the ridge of mountains or hills along there, and so they called it Oak Ridge. By the fall of 43, they had set up a newspaper, naturally, the Oak Ridger, and it was a pretty darn good little newspaper for local news. Of course, the big moment in the whole history of Oak Ridge is after the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Now, I'm sure that lots of people knew that a bomb was being made, and see, we didn't know that the bomb had been tested in Alamogordo. We didn't know. But we knew that that there were a lot of us that knew that this is what the end point was going to be. But it was one very big evening when we learned that that this is what it was. A second big evening came sometime later, some months or years later, when they opened the city. See, up until they opened the city sometime after the war, you still had to have a badge to get in. And without that badge, hey, it's you just couldn't get in. But when they opened the city, whatever date that was, they on the gate on it that goes to Clinton, they brought in electricity from a pile or from a reactor that was out at X10, and they put a thing across the gate with a little magnesium strip in the center, so that when the electricity came to it, it blew it up in a poof. And that just happens to be one of the pictures that I took of Oak Ridge being opened up, a poof of smoke.
Goodness, I think we've covered a lot of ground. Let's see. Well, looking back over it all, what would you think that future generations should think about the Manhattan Project? Or know about the Manhattan
Well,
Project?
I tell you, if you look at how things are done in this day, I would think it would be almost one would think it would be impossible to have done this. I think that the everything leading up to the decision, and then the manner in which it was brought about without, they didn't have to deal with Congress. They didn't have to deal with committees. They didn't have to. As far as I know, General Groves could do what he wished, and he was determined to get it done. And I'm just amazed that it actually happened. The only thing that one might compare to it, and it really wasn't anywhere near the magnitude of this, is putting a man on the moon. That took a lot of coordination and a lot of technical expertise, and it got done, but not in the time scale. Golly, they putting a man on the moon. They had some years of background work. So I think that it is something that people will look back on and with great admiration. Now, I think that there is a legitimate reason. This is not any rationale of mine in 1943 or anywhere near, but in the subsequent years, I think that there is good reason to question whether it's a good idea to have done it in the first place. But I can't tell you how many hundreds of people that have spoken to me after they learned that I had worked on the Manhattan Project, that did not. I can't tell you how many people there were that came to me and said, "I'm so glad that you were part of this, and that because my father or my brother or whoever was on one of the islands and was getting set to invade Japan, and there's the people who were in the armed forces, the people who were going to die by the thousands or hundreds of thousands if they tried to invade Japan. These people are mighty, mighty thankful. I look back on it and I say, golly, after the first one, did you really need to have the second one? And whoever was in charge evidently figured that they had to, because they weren't moving fast enough in the direction of surrender. I've heard the argument also that that if you could have made a demonstration of it, brought the leaders together and say, look, this is what we have, and maybe that would have been enough. But all of that is second guessing. Now, one thing that I didn't know about, as a matter of fact, I didn't know about it until I read Mr. Rhodes' book on the subject, and that is that, as you know, this effort was made possible virtually by the Jewish scientists that were driven out of Europe and came to this country and devoted their time and effort. It's, in large measure, this is true, I think. Once the war was over in Germany, many of these Jewish scientists kind of lost all interest. I mean, they seemed to be in it for winning the war in Germany, and they were not interested in fighting Japan, or they didn't think that they ought to be used in Japan. That came as a kind of a surprise to me. I never did think about that.